Namaskar. Hello and welcome to 𝗖𝗏𝗄𝗏 channel. I'm your host Sree Iyer. Today is episode 4 of our series on Christianity. Let's welcome our guest Kalavai Venkat. Venkat, namaskar and welcome to 𝗖𝗏𝗄𝗏 channel. How are you?
Namaskaram, Shrey. Doing good. How are you?
I'm good, sir. Looking forward to episode 4. Please go ahead.
All right. In the first three episodes, we covered the following topics. In episode one, we saw that no, we don't have to bring up the slide now. Let me give a
I know, I
brief
know, I know.
introduction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
ahead.
All right. So in episode one, we saw that the Virgin Mary was twice married. She had 7 children, and she probably had a lover too. Then in episode two, we saw a very different narrative of Jesus. So in that, there is a first person testimony of Jesus where he says he had 2 wives and children and that he eventually killed them. Then in that, we also saw the testimony of the New Testament that Jesus was a drunkard and a glutton. Then when we went to part 3, we discussed whether there was a historical Jesus or whether Jesus is a myth. So we went through all of the details. Particularly, we talked about there is no incident in the life of Jesus mentioned except the last 18 to 24 months of his life. So that's unlikely to be a historical character. But when we talked about myth, I had also highlighted a point that even a mythical story could contain a kernel of truth. And then it gets expanded. I had brought up the example of Kabir Das. Kabir Das lived about 600 years ago, 700 years ago. And Rabindranath Tagore compiled the top 100 of his poems. And then it was put through analysis. Then what it turned out was only 6% of those poems were composed by Kabir Das. The remaining 94 were written decades later, centuries later, and retroactively projected onto Kabir Das. So what it tells you is that even fictional output could still contain a kernel of truth. So the question is, the Jesus of the New Testament is a lie. And we have already gone through a lot of those things, and that Jesus did not exist. But is it possible that a historical Jesus existed? It's not the Jesus of the New Testament, but it's a different Jesus. Now to get into that, uh, before we go into the slide, okay, don't bring up the slide yet. I want to kind of throw a very interesting story here. If Jesus had been crucified, if a Jesus existed, if he really lived, and if he had been crucified, what would have happened? So in the previous episode, I pointed out the summary of John Dominic Crossan that the crucified convicts were thrown into an open pit, and then they were not given a decent burial. They were denied that. And mostly these are mass graves. They will just throw the dead body, they will bring it down from the cross and throw the corpse into the pit. And then the dogs and other animals will pounce on it and tear into the flesh. And slowly it will decay. And finally, the Romans will come and throw some dirt over that. That's the way they would treat crucified convicts. So if Jesus had been crucified, he would not even have got a decent burial. How do we know that for sure? Because in the entire history of crucifixion, where hundreds of thousands of people have been crucified during the Roman era, we have only one corpse that was recovered. That was of a person by the name Yohanan. He was in his early 30s. He had been crucified. And how do we know that? Because the nail, the iron nail they used to pierce the knee, to pierce the uh, uh, leg joints, that got stuck inside. So when they brought the corpse down, that got stuck inside. And for some strange reason, they handed over the corpse to the family to bury that. And that's why we found out centuries later that this person was crucified and his name was Yohanan because he was put in an ossuary and kept in a family tomb. And today we are going to talk about what is ossuary. But the bottom line is, if somebody was crucified, it was the most humiliating punishment. It not only made the person suffer on the cross, but he was humiliated even after death, that he won't get a decent burial. And in the entire history of mankind, we have only one case of a person who was crucified and who was then given a decent burial. So if Jesus had been crucified, it's highly improbable that he would have even got a decent burial. He would have been thrown into the pit along with other crucified convicts, and you wouldn't be able to recognize it at all. But archaeology, genetics, and other studies, they always throw some very epigraphy and other disciplines. They always throw some data that's highly interesting. So in 1980, they carried out an archaeological exploration. It was an accidental exploration in Egypt. There's a town called Talpiot, that's near Jerusalem. They were building an apartment complex and they started blasting the site. And when they did that, they found a tomb. So what was that? To understand that, we have to go back to uh, the first century Israel. I'm talking about the period roughly starting from, let's say, around 100 BC to roughly around 70 or 80 or 90 AD, roughly about 150 to 200 years. There was a very different form of burial that was practiced by the Jews and the early Jewish Christians. What was that burial? When somebody died, and this was especially applicable to people who were rich, people who were influential, and people who had positions of power. So, what will happen is when somebody died, they will take that body and then they will put it inside a rock hewn tomb. And then they will just close the entrance to the tomb with a big rock, roll it over, and shut it. And then they leave the corpse to sit inside and desiccate for the next year or so. So roughly after a year or so, the all the moisture would have desiccated, all the flesh in the corpse would have withered away, and all that would be left is bones. So after a year has passed, some of the family members will come, they'll open the tomb, they will collect all the bones, and then they will put the bones inside a bone box known as ossuary or ossuary. And they will inscribe the name, but the name is not always inscribed. Some of the boxes, bone boxes or ossuaries, will have an inscription. Many of them will not, or some of them will not. Then they will close all of those and then put them inside. So the big picture is influential families will have their own private tomb. And then when a person dies, they'll first bring the body, keep it there, and cover it with a shroud and everything, and leave it there for a year. And then it will completely desiccate. Then they will come back, collect the bones, put it inside an ossuary, and keep it inside one of the niches of this family tomb. So if you went into a family tomb, what you will find is the ossuaries of the various family members that were collected over a period of time. This is what happened in Talpiot. So they started blasting. They found a very interesting tomb, and then they called the Israeli archaeological department. They came, and now you can bring up the slide. So what you will find is two books on the left-hand side. So one is by 𝗤𝗏 𝗢𝗏𝗏, Charles Pellegrino, and a few others. And then also it has André Fauerberger, who's professor of statistics and mathematics at the University of Toronto, and of course James Tabor. And then right below you have another book. These two books provide all the details, but let me give a summary. So what they found inside this tomb was a collection of 10 ossuaries. Out of those, 6 had inscription. Inscription is the name of the dead person inscribed on it. And then 4 of them did not have any inscription. Like I said, that was quite normal because not every time somebody would be inscribing it. The literacy rate in those days in Israel was pretty low. So what were the names? The first name was Yeshua bar Yosef, that is Jesus, son of Joseph. So in the New Testament, in the Bible, Joseph is the earthly father of Jesus. And you find that name here. Then you find Maria. Maria is the name of Mary, or Miriam in Hebrew, but here it is written as Maria, and we'll talk about that towards the end. Then you have the third name, which is Mariamne Mara. Okay. So Mariamne is the name, it's a diminutive in Greek, and it's the name of Mary Magdalene. And go to the next slide. Then the fourth name you have is Yosi or Yose, which is found only in couple of verses in the Bible, which is Mark 6:3 and then Matthew 13:55. This is a short form uh, 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 for Joseph, and this is used only in a couple of places in the Bible. And very interestingly, that is the name mentioned here. And this Yose is a brother of Jesus. Then there are two other names. There is a name called Mattia. This Mattia does not at all appear in this form of Mattia. It appears in other forms like, Matthias in plural and then Matitea and other things, but not Mattia. So this interesting form happens only once. It's not found anywhere, and it's only found on one of these ossuaries. And the last one is Judah, son of Jesus. That's pretty interesting, and we'll come to that in a minute. So what happens is Andre Feuerberger now takes all these names. Each one of these names is not unique in itself. Okay, these were by and large common names, although Yossi and Mattia are not common names, and similarly Mariamne is a Greek diminutive and it's again not common. But the rest of the names are quite common, like Jesus was a common name, and then like Mariam would have been a common name. So each one of the names is by itself not very interesting, not very telling. However, when they appear in a cluster, it becomes very interesting. To give a simple analogy, let's say you go and attend an IPL match in Delhi's Firozshah Kotla or someplace like that, and let's say there are 50,000 spectators watching that match. Suppose somebody makes an announcement, I am looking for a person by the name Akash. Probably there'll be 500 people with that name or 200 people with that name. But then when you tell them Akash from Greater Kailash 1, then probably instead of 200, now there will be 20 people raising their hands. And if you said, this Akash, who has a younger brother who goes by this nickname Sunny, okay, then probably you are going to have one or two persons raising their hands. So cluster makes all the difference, okay, because when you have a cluster and the cluster is quite unique, then you are looking at a high probability of a non-accidental occurrence. That means we probably are looking at the family of Jesus, even though it does not match New Testament correctly. But then as we have seen before, New Testament itself is a very forged text written over many centuries. So we should not use that as the yardstick, a reference frame to compare against, but we should look at the concordance of names in the clusters itself. So Andre Feuerberger comes up with a finding, and then he says the odds that this is not the family tomb of Jesus is only 1 in 600. That is, the odds ratio is so overwhelming. It is 99.83% that this is the family tomb of Jesus. So this is the finding of some of these top scholars I mentioned. And then what we'll do is we'll ask a couple of questions. Okay, so those of you who are familiar with the Bible, with the story of Christianity, would know something very interesting. Okay, that James, the brother of Jesus, was a very influential character in the early ministry of Jesus. That's the story which the Bible tells, but that's also the theme of many important books, research publications, etc. So, for example, James, Brother of Jesus by Robert Eisenman, Professor Robert Eisenman, is a very important book that tells you the importance James had in the early Jewish Christian missionary. He was considered the leader. That's why even Paul in his epistle says that he went and he met with James to give himself some credibility. So you will ask, James was the brother of Jesus. Where is the James ossuary? Why is that missing from this family tomb? So it turns out in 1980, when the IAA or the Israel Antiquities Authority, they excavated this tomb, they documented actually 11 ossuaries. Not 10, but 11. Now we have only 10. So one of them was lost. One of them was stolen. And then it so happened that it showed up in the antiquities market. And then that's how all the smuggling happens. And finally, it was put up in museum. And luckily, IAA had recorded the dimensions and all the descriptions on the ossuary, even though it did not, uh, uh, you know, uh, safekeep them. Okay, or it was stolen from the safekeeping. But regardless, they had measured the dimensions. They had recorded that very diligently. So Professor James Tabor measures that against the market, against the James ossuary that was found in the market, and they matched. But science is not dependent on just one factor. What they did was they looked at uh, ways, Charles Pellegrino and others, they looked at ways in which we can actually ascertain that this James ossuary came from the Talpiot tomb or the Jesus family tomb. How can we find out? When ossuaries are sitting inside the tomb for centuries, lot of minerals and other substances get deposited uh, on the surface of the ossuary or the bone box. So this is known as patina. And this patina, it's spelled as Patina, and this patina can be now analyzed for its profile. So if two ossuaries are sitting inside a tomb for several centuries, they will have a very identical patina profile. So patina will have all the minerals, different, metal deposits and everything. And what they did was they took the samples of this patina from both the James ossuary and from some of the ossuaries in the Jesus family tomb, and they matched. That's a pretty convincing evidence that the James ossuary was originally in the Talpiot tomb. So James, brother of Jesus, had also been put inside the same tomb, and subsequently in 1980, that ossuary got stolen. So this increases the probability, and Andre Fauerberger says that from 600 to 1, the odds ratio, this now increases to 30,000 to 1. But we saw that even at 600 to 1, it is 99.83% certain that this is the family tomb of Jesus. So,
and could they date this thing to what date it goes?
Yes, they very well could, using multiple techniques. Some of that I'll be talking about. Okay, but I talked about patina. That gives a very good indication. But in this case, they did something very interesting. They did a lead isotope analysis. So according to the Bible, Jesus and his family, they hailed from Nazareth, right? So Nazareth is further away from Talpiot. Okay, so and then they travel to Jerusalem. That's the story it is told. Now, let's say that story is true. You will find some kind of an isotope connection between, for the bones, like for example, the people can drink water. Okay, so what they did was they took the isotope profile of the water from the aquifers from the 1st century Nazareth, and then they extracted uh, some of these isotopes from the bone samples from inside these ossuaries found in the Talpiot tomb. And then they ran the lead isotope profile against both the samples, and they matched. So this is another very interesting confirmation, answering your question, Sree Iyer, that the lead isotope content and the profile in the water from the 1st century Nazareth aquifers exactly matches the lead isotope profile of the bones inside the ossuaries in the Talpiot tomb. Then there are other ways to determine that by looking at whether the patina deposits have been disturbed when inscribing. Okay, that will tell you whether it's a later inscription or not. But also by looking at the style of inscription, the epigraphic style and other things, they can date it. And these have been pretty accurately dated, and there is no debate about that. So coming back to the James ossuary, what they found was initially there was an allegation, okay, that this is a forgery. It does not belong to James. It only because the ossuary the name reads James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So some academics argued that the brother of Jesus was added later on, but this has been subject to pretty good test, patina analysis, and it has been proven now that the patina was never disturbed, and what we find, the entire inscription is authentic and it goes back to the 1st century AD. So this is how they determine. And then the presence of the James ossuary once again confirms or strengthens the probability that we are looking at the Jesus family tomb. And let's look at two other examples. In the Bible, there is a narrative. And then according to this narrative, which happens in Mark 15:21, there is a person by the name Simon from Cyrene. Okay, Cyrene is a small town, and there is a person by name Simon who comes along with his sons, Alexander and Rufus. He has two sons. He comes with them to Jerusalem when Jesus is being taken away for crucifixion. So on the way, Jesus trips over and he falls, and then the Roman soldiers, this is a story told by the New Testament, and the Roman soldiers order Simon to help him with the cross. So is the Simon a historical character? It turns out yes. Okay. What happened was the ossuary of Simon from Cyrene was found, and his name was inscribed. And not only that, he might not have been a very rich person, because the same ossuary contained the bones of both Simon and one of his sons, Alexander, and both their names are inscribed on the ossuary. And that ossuary is now on display at the Hebrew University Museum. So now this is very another interesting data point. We have mention of Simon in the New Testament, and we have an ossuary of Simon right here in Israel from the same period. So once again, this adds or this reinforces the identification of the Talpiot tomb with the Jesus family. Then, go ahead, please.
1521 is what you said about Simon. That's in 16th century.
No. I was quoting the verse number, Mark 15:21. Okay. Mark 15:21, chapter 15, verse 21, talks about Simon. Okay, Simon from Cyrene.
Okay.
So,
okay.
And then you have the ossuary of Simon from Cyrene. Okay.
Okay.
Then the next person who is very important to the early Christian church is Peter. So the Christian story or the Christian claim is that he founded the Church of Rome. And of course, we know that is not true. Okay. And the entire story, but of course, I'll first recount the story of the church. The Christian story is that Peter came to Rome and he founded the church, and he was persecuted, and then he was crucified upside down. And when he died, finally he was buried, and then his tomb lies underneath the Vatican. And of course, no such remains have been found at all in Vatican. And it's almost certain that Peter never even went to Rome. Okay, how do we know that? Due to many reasons. Okay, so first and foremost, he was an illiterate person. He was just a fisherman. And then for a fisherman from Galilee to go to Rome and to convert people, to learn a new language, and all these things is next to impossible. But 𝗏 also makes a very important observation that Paul's epistles are the earliest Christian writings according to mainstream academics. And 𝗏 points out that Paul writes in his epistles, his letters to Romans, he mentions 24 or 25 church leaders. But Peter is not one of those. Okay, that is very striking, very interesting. If a historical Peter had really been in Rome and he was the rock of the church, then you should find at least some reference in Paul's writings, but you do not find. Instead, what Paul writes is that he goes back to Jerusalem, where he meets Peter and James, and then he reports back. So this disproves the Christian story that Peter founded the church in Rome, and then he was crucified and he is buried under the Vatican. That's absolutely disproven. However, what we find is something very interesting. In Jerusalem, there is this Mount of Olives, and then in the Mount of Olives, in the early 1950s, they discovered, his name was Bellarmino Bagatti, a very good archaeologist and also a Christian priest himself, a Catholic priest himself, and a very good archaeologist. And then he identified the ossuary of one Simon bar Yona, right there in the Mount of Olives. That again dates from the 1st century. And who's this Simon Bar-Yonah, all you have to do is look at Matthew 16:17, where Jesus addresses Peter by the name, "You are Simon Bar-Yonah." Okay, so Simon Bar-Yonah was the name of Peter because Peter is not even a Hebrew word or an Aramaic word; it's a Greek word. Okay, so whereas the original name was Simon Bar-Yonah, and his ossuary was found, and then it has been perfectly dated, and epigraphy, everything has been verified. So this is another data point that Peter, who is very critical to the early Christian church, his ossuary has also been found. So when you put all these things, we are now getting to the kernel of the story, that while everything the New Testament tells about Jesus is mythical, okay, it's a myth and not a credible story, the story itself contains a kernel of the truth once we do a bit of forensic analysis and we start finding out. And that's what we have done so far today, but we are going to get into something even more interesting from this point onwards. So what we find is there could have been a historical Jesus, and this historical Jesus had some siblings, okay, a few siblings. They were buried with him. And then there is reference to Simon Bar-Yonah. Yeah, just one second. There's reference to Simon Bar-Yonah. There is reference to Simon from Cyrene, and all of those ossuaries have been found. And that's once again a pretty good indication that corroborates the claim that this is the Jesus family too. I'll take your question. Then I have a couple of more very interesting points to add. Go ahead.
Yeah, viewers, for some reason, the notification has not come out for this. We have the portrait mode and landscape mode. Whichever mode you are watching, could you please like this video? Thank you so much. Back to you.
Okay. All right. So then bring up the first slide again and let's go back to that story there. So in the first slide, let's stay here. Second slide is better. Okay. So this slide, you have this name Maria and Mariamne, and then Mariamne, assuming this is Mary Magdalene, what will we find? Okay, we will find that the lead isotope content that we talked about earlier. Okay, because she did not grow up in Nazareth, right? She came from elsewhere, and then she is buried in this tomb. So depending on where she grew up, her isotope content, her profile extracted from the bones would be very different, okay, from that of the rest of the ossuaries in the same tomb. Guess what? That's exactly what it turned out to be. Okay, her isotope profile, lead isotope profile, was different. That tells you while the rest of the ossuaries belong to one family, members of one family, Mariamne did not belong to the family. She came from outside. So who could come from outside and get their ossuary placed in a family tomb? Only someone who is married into that family. So if this Mariamne or Mary Magdalene had been married to Jesus, then you would expect to find a tomb right here in this Talpiot tomb. You'll expect to find an ossuary right here in the Talpiot tomb. But that's not the only evidence. Okay, we have another evidence too. They wanted to carry out what is called a paleo DNA analysis. Okay, this is for a search for ancient DNA. When you go into the bones, you can extract some DNA out of that, and then you can carry out a lot of tests. And of course, the quality deteriorates as time goes by. This is almost 2000 years. But there are 5 such absolutely great paleo DNA labs in the world, and one of them is in Canada. That's where the samples were taken and tested. And what did they test for? They looked for Y chromosomal markers, but they could not get anything because the paternal DNA had totally deteriorated. However, they were able to extract mitochondrial DNA. What is the difference between the two? You inherit Y chromosomes from your father, from your paternal side, whereas you get your mitochondrial DNA from your maternal side. Okay, so in this case, if Mariamne had come from outside, okay, then her mitochondrial DNA will be very different from that of the rest of the family members, because she does not have
True.
the same mother
True.
as the rest of family members. And the paleo DNA test confirmed exactly that, and it said, no, she came from outside and she's not part of this family. That means she was married to Jesus. This now brings us to the, okay, let's talk about Mariamne a little bit more. Let's keep that slide on. Okay, let's talk about Mariamne a little bit more. Mariamne, in that ossuary, her name is inscribed as Mariamne Mara. Okay, so Mariam Mara means a teacher, a leader. Okay, so that's what James Tabor, Stephen Schumacher, and all these great scholars have repeatedly pointed out, that in the early Christian church, Mary Magdalene played a very important role. She was a teacher. She preached. Okay, she performed healing. Of course, all of those are, uh, kind of, uh, not real medicine. But then she did all those things, and she was a respected leader. Okay, in the early Christian church, in the very early decades. So uh, that's why her name is in Greek diminutive. It's Mariamne, even though it's a variant of Miriam or Maria. It's written as Mariamne because that was inscribed by her followers. So when she died, they brought her bones back. They they brought her body back. They put it in the family tomb, collected the bones a year later, put it in the ossuary, and inscribed it with the name Mariamne in the Greek diminutive. And the same thing with Maria. Okay, Maria, once again, the Israeli epigraphers once again point out a very important factor, that Maria as a name, okay, is very rare in uh, Hebrew inscriptions, okay, in ossuaries at least. So once again, this is indicative of the fact that after Jesus died, probably uh, his mother, the Virgin Mary, she was also preaching and carrying out her missionary activity, but she must have also preached to mostly uh, Greek or the Latinized Roman soldiers who were serving in, or settlers who were living in Israel. So that's why her name is also inscribed as Maria and not as Miriam in Hebrew. Go to the next slide, and I'll bring up the last point. So the last point, Judas, son of Jesus, that's the most interesting point. Okay, so this person seems to have died young, probably 10, 12 years of age, and he has been buried. Okay, so uh, the Bible doesn't tell us that Jesus was married. Okay, but not being married would have been a very strange thing for a Jewish rabbi or for any Jewish person, because in those days they got married early, in their late teens or something, or early 20s. But for someone not to remain married until 33, 34 years of age, that's a rarity. Okay, so that would have been very strange in Israel. And in fact, you are required to marry early too. And so in this case, if we find this inscription, Judah, son of Jesus. Okay, Judah is Judas. Okay, so then was he the son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene? Is that the reason his uh, ossuary is placed inside the Talpiot tomb, or the Jesus family tomb? And unfortunately, they could not extract any mitochondrial DNA or any paleo DNA from the bone remains of this Judah, son of Jesus ossuary. So we cannot prove that he in fact shared the mitochondrial DNA or inherited that from his mother, Mary Magdalene. But putting all the circumstances together, we can very much say that, well, he was, if this is indeed the family tomb of Jesus, then Jesus had a wife by the name Mariamne or Mary Magdalene, and then a son by the name Judas. But that Judas also seems to have died young, and with that, the entire Jesus lineage and the family seems to have come to an end. Now, this is the most important argument. This documentary was made way back in, this entire story was turned into a documentary way back in 2007 or 8. It's called The Lost Tomb of Jesus. It was produced by James Cameron, the famous Hollywood director, but it's an absolutely great documentary, and it was directed by 𝗤𝗏𝗄𝗏. And uh, in India, the churches campaigned with the canvas of the government. The Congress was ruling India at the time, and then they blocked the documentary from being telecast. The church does not want the world to know, and even Discovery Channel telecast it once and then took it out. Okay, so but you can still find the documentary online. You can go to YouTube, you can still find it. Just search for the lost tomb of Jesus and you will find it. But shouldn't the Christians be excited that they found the tomb of Jesus? Okay, and then that place should have become a pilgrimage place because you have the tomb of Jesus, you have the ossuary of Jesus, then probably the bones of Jesus, and who knows, when all the genetic technology, everything grows, you can extract some DNA from that and you can bring Jesus back to life, right? And that'll be a strange predicament. Jesus once again running around the streets of New York, in 2025-30. But why aren't Christians excited? Why are Christians so keen on suppressing this evidence? The answer for that comes from the writings of Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:14. Okay, in 1 Corinthians 15:14, Paul says, Jesus was crucified and then he was resurrected. And if this is not true, Christianity is a lie. So if Jesus was resurrected, then you should not find any of his bone remains. That's why Christians have the story of the empty tomb. Uh, his, the two women, the two Marys, they go to the tomb and they find the body missing. That's the story. The Christian story is the entire body of Jesus rose up and then he was resurrected and carried to heaven. That's why the body is missing. So if the body is missing, then you cannot desiccate it and you cannot collect the bones, put it inside the ossuary a year later for the posterity to discover that in the 20th century. So the finding of these ossuaries and connecting them with the Jesus family completely demolishes Christianity using the same falsification criteria that the Bible itself gives. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:14 that Jesus was resurrected, and if that is not true, then Christianity is false. So this proves that Christianity is a false religion, although there is a kernel of truth to the exhaustive lie called Christianity. And that kernel of truth could be that there was indeed a Jesus, and then he did have a family, but he seems to have been having a small following, because even in the Bible, you can see some of the verses where Jesus says, keep all of these teachings secret. Okay, he doesn't want the world to know. Okay, that was a normal thing if you're running a secret cult. Okay, you do not want others to find out and you do not want to get caught. Then you will come up with all of these instructions to your followers. Keep it a secret. Don't disclose to anyone what I have taught you. Jesus says all these things. And in the early parts, there could have been a Jesus, but we do not know what he taught, and we will never be able to find out. We can speculate, but we can say with confidence that the story or the Jesus of the New Testament is an absolute fabrication. It's an absolute forgery. Whereas there could have been another Jesus, which is disclosed by this Talpiot tomb. But we will never know what he taught or what the contents of his teachings would have been, or how he died. But we can say with confidence that he was not crucified for various reasons. Okay, they recovered quite a few bones of his body in the ossuary, and none of them bore any mark of trauma, any of the nails driven into that. The same the case with the Simon Boriona or the Peter ossuary. Okay, even though the Christian church claims that he was crucified in Rome, we already saw he was not. He did not even go to Rome, but he was not even crucified because no trauma, nothing on the bones and other remains. We already saw the example of Johanan, only case where an iron is driven into the keel of the leg and still sits in the bone, but no such thing with the Jesus ossuary. So that debunks the Christian story, but throws open a very tantalizing possibility that there could have been a kernel of truth to the historical Jesus, because there are many Jesuses in that first century. They were all apocalyptic. They expected the world to come to an end, and that's why They did not care about the family. Even Jesus says, abandon your family and follow me. Okay. And the reason why we will not know what he taught was that Jesus expected the world to come to an end very soon. And hence, there was no motivation to write down anything. Thank you. Back to you. You're speaking on mute.
The date of this ossuaries was what?
First century AD. Okay, so
First
somewhere
century.
somewhere between uh, uh, 30, 40, because it's always, plus or minus, there is a range. But
Okay.
starting from that period until around 70 or 80 AD, because by that time, around 70 or 80 AD, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the practice of secondary burial, it's called secondary burial, right? First, they'll put the body inside a cave, let it desiccate for a year, then go and collect the bones and put it inside this ossuary. And that's called the second, and keep it inside the niche. That's called secondary burial. That came to an end around 70 or 80 AD.
Thank you so much, Miss. Thank you so much. And this is a very, what I would say is black and white story. You have in perhaps a rich person and he has a family, and the whole thing seems to have been constructed out of the fact that there was a set of names, and beyond that, everything else is make believe.
See, Christianity is India Alliance or 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Okay, so earlier in the previous episodes, I was pointing out that there was not one Christianity for the first 400 years, right? Like in the previous episode, we discussed Marcion, we discussed Ebionites and a few other Christian sects. And there are multiple Christian sects in the first 400 years. For example, Marcion around 140 AD. Okay, he was in Rome between 139 and 145. So somewhere around that time, he publishes the first canon of what we can call the New Testament. And it has only 11 books, whereas now it has 27 books. So there are multiple Christianities. They're competing with one another, and they did not even have the common set of beliefs. Okay, not everyone agreed on everything. So what happened was, if you are taking this to Rome, and then if you are becoming big, okay, as a religion, and you are attracting new converts, then you don't have a lot of schism among yourselves, and you don't keep fighting among yourselves. You will kind of form a 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Okay, you will form an India alliance. They all came together, and then even though there were a lot of doctrinal conflicts, some of them were able to come together, and then those who did not, they were declared heresies, and then they were suppressed, and they were banned, and they were persecuted. For example, Marcion, until the 4th century, he had a large following. Even though he died in the 2nd century, his followers continued to thrive until the 4th century. That's what 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 informs us. But after that, Marcion Christianity died because they were simply suppressed. Similarly, there was another strand of Christianity known as Arianism, which was very famous, which was very popular. Even Constantine was baptized by an Arian priest. It was another form of Christianity that was suppressed. So what happened is, uh, there are many forms of Jewish Christianity, even in Israel. But when it spread to Rome, it absorbed a lot of pagan elements, a lot of Gnostic elements, everything. And then there are many more. So they all had to be brought together under one umbrella and form a 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. That's how Christianity was created. It has a little bit of kernel of truth and a lot of lies on top of that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Venkat, and we'll be back again next week. The next episode is going to be in Tamil on Wednesday at 7 p.m. IST. Next episode in English, episode 5, will be on Friday at 8 o'clock. Thank you once again, Venkatji. Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaskar.